Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The Vicksburg courthouse records of 1847 mention a peculiar case, a plantation fire that claimed no lives but destroyed what was once considered the most profitable cotton estate in Warren County. The official report attributes the cause to accidental circumstances during evening hours, but those who have studied the case know that accidental was merely a convenient explanation for something far more disturbing. The Three Oaks Plantation stood as a monument to Southern prosperity for nearly 50 years before the flames reduced it to ash and memory. Located at a bend in the Big Black River, where the soil was particularly rich, the plantation had produced cotton yields that were the envy of neighboring estates. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with 6 imposing columns, overlooked nearly 2,000 acres of cultivated land. Behind it stood the quarters where approximately 80 enslaved people lived in conditions that historical accounts describe as particularly severe even by the harsh standards of the time. Eveline Morgan was not her real name. Born into slavery around 1820, she was known simply as Evie to other slaves, and the Tall One to the Morgan family who owned the Three Oaks Plantation, located 7 miles east of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The property, situated along a bend in the Big Black River, had been in the Morgan family since 1798, when the territory was still being disputed between various powers. Thomas Morgan, the third-generation owner of Three Oaks, had inherited the property in 1835 following his father's death from yellow fever. Unlike his father, who had maintained a certain paternalistic attitude toward those he enslaved, Thomas was known for his strictly business approach to plantation management. Under his direction, production increased by nearly 30% within 5 years, an achievement mentioned favorably in the Vicksburg Economic Quarterly of 1840. The publication made no mention of the methods used to achieve such gains. What makes Eveline's case remarkable is not just what happened on that April night in 1847, but how the events were systematically erased from official records. The only reason we know about her at all is because of a journal kept by Dr. William Ferris, a physician who treated slaves at several plantations in the region between 1840 and 1869. Dr. Ferris was something of an anomaly in antebellum Mississippi. Educated at the University of Pennsylvania, he had returned to his native Vicksburg with ideas about medicine that sometimes conflicted with local practices. His journal reveals a man torn between scientific curiosity and the social constraints of his environment. He writes of treating the enslaved with the same medical protocols he would apply to anyone, while acknowledging that his views were not popularly held among those who sign my accounts. In one passage dated May 3, 1847, Dr. Ferris writes, "Called again to Three Oaks, though nothing remains of it now but charred timber and ash. Examined the woman E., who remains in a peculiar state of mind. She appears calm when awake, but the symptoms manifest most strongly during sleep. The Morgan family insists she must stand trial, though I have advised against it, as her condition presents medical interest beyond local understanding." The journal entries grow increasingly detailed about Eveline's condition, though they're clinical in nature. Dr. Ferris describes a phenomenon he'd never encountered before, a person who appeared to be fully conscious while sleepwalking. His note suggests that Eveline would rise from her sleeping quarters in the dead of night, eyes open but unseeing, and perform complex tasks with precision that surprised even those who knew her well. According to testimony from other house servants recorded in a deposition that was never formally filed, Eveline had been observed sleepwalking for at least 2 years prior to the fire. Martha, another house slave approximately 50 years of age, who had been with the Morgan family for decades, reported that Eveline would sometimes prepare food, sweep floors, or rearrange items while completely asleep. Her eyes would be open, Martha stated, but there was nobody home behind them. You could wave a hand before her face, and she would not blink. Yet she would step around a chair that had been moved since she last saw it awake. The Morgan family was apparently aware of these episodes, but found them more curious than concerning. Catherine Morgan, the plantation mistress, had even mentioned the phenomenon to visitors as a form of parlor curiosity. "Our Eveline walks in her sleep," she would say, according to accounts. "Last Tuesday, she folded all the linens and didn't remember a thing come morning." The weather in Vicksburg during April 1847 had been unusually dry according to meteorological records kept by the Riverport authorities. No significant rainfall had been recorded for nearly 3 weeks, and the timber of the plantation buildings would have been particularly susceptible to fire. This fact was noted in the initial investigation, but ultimately deemed irrelevant to the case's final disposition. The fire that consumed Three Oaks Plantation began shortly after midnight on April 29, 1847. The main house was the first to ignite, followed by the cotton storehouse, processing shed, and eventually most of the surrounding structures. According to weather records from that period, the night was unusually still, with no wind to speak of, which makes the rapid spread of the fire all the more peculiar. Thomas Morgan, the plantation owner, was in New Orleans on business. His wife Catherine, their 3 adult children, and the house servants all escaped without injury, though the family's prized possessions and several seasons' worth of cotton were destroyed. Initial assumptions pointed to a kitchen fire or lightning strike, despite the clear skies reported that night. The economic impact of the fire was substantial. In addition to the buildings and personal property, approximately 300 bales of cotton were destroyed, representing a value of nearly $15,000, an enormous sum in 1847. Insurance records, preserved in the Vicksburg Historical Society archives, show that Thomas Morgan had increased his fire coverage just 6 months prior, a coincidence that initially raised suspicions among the underwriters. It wasn't until 3 days later that suspicion fell on Eveline. A stable boy claimed to have seen her walking from the main house toward the cotton storehouse shortly before the first flames appeared. His account describes her as moving like a ghost, steady but strange, carrying something small that glowed. What followed was a quiet investigation kept out of public records and newspapers. The Morgan family, conscious of their standing in Vicksburg society, preferred to handle the matter privately. This explains the absence of this case from most historical accounts of the period. However, Dr. Ferris's journal, discovered during a renovation of his former office in 1965, provides a window into this forgotten incident. The phenomenon that Dr. Ferris documented in Eveline's case is what modern medicine would classify as a parasomnia, a sleep disorder involving abnormal movements or behaviors during sleep. But in 1847 Mississippi, such conditions were often viewed through a lens of superstition or even accusations of demonic influence. There exists among the local population a tendency to attribute unusual behaviors to supernatural causes, Dr. Ferris wrote on May 7th. Several of the household staff refused to be in the same room as E.E., claiming she is possessed by spirits. Even Mrs. Morgan, an educated woman by local standards, has asked whether an exorcism might be appropriate. I have attempted to explain the medical nature of somnambulism, with limited success. Eveline herself claimed to have no memory of setting any fires. When questioned, she expressed confusion and distress at the accusations. Dr. Ferris notes, upon direct questioning, E. becomes agitated, insisting she would never do such a thing intentionally. She speaks of dreams where she walks through fields of tall grass that part before her. In these dreams, she carries light, not fire. The investigation took an unusual turn when Catherine Morgan, the plantation mistress, came forward with information that complicated the narrative. According to Dr. Ferris's journal, Mrs. Morgan confided that Eveline had been experiencing these episodes of sleepwalking since shortly after a severe punishment, administered by the overseer, a man named Harlan Price. Price had been hired by Thomas Morgan in 1844 after the previous overseer resigned, citing disagreement over management methods. Within a year of Price's appointment, productivity at Three Oaks had increased significantly, though so had incidents of punishment and at least 2 deaths among the enslaved population, attributed in records to fever and accident with farm equipment. The journal entry dated May 12, 1847 reads, Mrs. M. has revealed that 2 years prior E. was severely beaten for allegedly assisting another slave's attempt to flee, 30 lashes administered by P., who had a reputation for excessive force. E. was bedridden for nearly a month. Upon recovery, she showed no outward resentment, maintaining her duties with the same quiet efficiency as before. It was shortly after this that the nocturnal activities began. This context cast the fire in a different light. Was it possible that Eveline's subconscious harbored a resentment her waking mind either suppressed or was unaware of? Dr. Ferris seemed to consider this possibility, though he framed it in the medical terminology of his time. The mind, when injured, seeks repair through channels invisible to the conscious self. A letter discovered in the Mississippi Baptist Historical Society archives, dated June 1845, provides additional context. Written by Reverend Elijah Simmons to a colleague in Tennessee, it mentions troubling practices at the Three Oaks Plantation. Brother Morgan permits his overseer liberties that I cannot condone, even in the management of the unfree. I have counseled him on Christian treatment of all souls under his authority, but worldly concerns of profit seem to override spiritual guidance. I fear what atmosphere is being cultivated under those ancient oaks. The investigation continued throughout May of 1847, but no formal charges were ever brought against Eveline. Instead, a peculiar arrangement was made. Dr. Ferris, whose interest in her condition had grown from professional curiosity to something approaching advocacy, offered to take responsibility for her. Thomas Morgan, perhaps seeing an opportunity to resolve a complicated situation without public scandal, agreed. The agreement, preserved in a private contract rather than court records, transferred Eveline's ownership to Dr. Ferris under the condition that she would be kept secure and studied for her unusual condition. The document refers to her as the subject, avoiding names entirely, further evidence of the Morgan family's desire to distance themselves from the incident. The financial terms of this transfer, noted in Dr. Ferris's account books rather than the journal, show that he paid substantially less than market value for a woman of Eveline's age and skills. This suggests Thomas Morgan's primary concern was resolving the matter quietly rather than recouping economic loss. Eveline was moved to a small outbuilding on Dr. Ferris's property in Vicksburg proper. His journal entries from this period detail his attempts to understand and treat her condition. He experimented with various sedatives common to the period, including laudanum and valerian root. He recorded her sleep patterns, noting that the episodes of sleepwalking occurred most frequently during the waning phase of the moon. The building where Eveline was housed still stands in Vicksburg, though it has been repurposed numerous times over the decades. Currently serving as a storage shed behind what is now a dental office, the structure gives no indication of its historical significance. Local preservationists have occasionally proposed a marker for the site, but these efforts have consistently been rejected. A particularly troubling entry dated August 17, 1847, reads, E. spoke in her sleep tonight, but not in English nor any dialect I recognize. The utterances had a rhythmic quality, almost like an incantation or prayer. Upon waking, she had no recollection of speaking, but mentioned dreams of ancestors, who she claims knew ways of sending the spirit forth while the body slept. Folk superstition, surely, but the coincidence is noteworthy. Dr. Ferris's attempts to record this unknown language proved challenging. His phonetic transcriptions suggest sounds not common to European languages, with patterns of repetition that linguistic scholars who later examined the journal tentatively identified as consistent with certain West African language groups, particularly those from the region now known as Ghana. By the fall of 1847, Dr. Ferris had begun inviting colleagues to observe Eveline during her episodes. These were private demonstrations, conducted with the understanding that the information was for medical advancement only. One such observer, Dr. James Holbrook from Philadelphia, left behind a letter describing what he witnessed. The subject, a Negro woman of approximately 27 years, exhibits the most extraordinary behavior during somnambulistic episodes. Unlike the typical sleepwalker who moves clumsily and without purpose, she performs complex actions with precision that suggests full awareness. Her eyes remain open, yet she does not respond to voices or even physical obstructions placed in her path. Instead, she navigates around them as if she had mapped the room in advance. Most remarkable was her ability to locate and manipulate objects hidden after she had fallen asleep, suggesting some heightened sense operating beyond normal perception. The Vicksburg of 1847 was a prosperous river port, its economy built on cotton and the slave labor that produced it. The city's elegant mansions and bustling commerce existed alongside the brutal reality of the plantation system. It was not a place where sympathy for slaves came easily, especially one suspected of destroying valuable property. Yet something about Eveline's case created just enough doubt to prevent the typical swift justice that would have been applied to such an offense. The city directories of the period list 17 physicians practicing in Vicksburg, but Dr. Ferris appears to have been one of only 3 who regularly treated enslaved patients. His practice, located on a side street away from the fashionable addresses, catered to a diverse clientele. Account books show payments from plantation owners, alongside those from freedmen and even river workers of various backgrounds. As Dr. Ferris continued his observations through the winter of 1847-48, Eveline's episodes began to change in nature. The sleepwalking became less frequent but more intense when it did occur. In December, he recorded an incident where she appeared to relive the night of the fire in precise detail, though she performed the actions with empty hands, pantomiming the carrying of an oil lamp, the opening of doors, the setting of a flame to cotton. It was as if watching the events of April 29th performed as a silent theater piece, and he wrote, "The precision of her movements, the deliberate pace, all suggest that if she did indeed set the fire, it was not a random act, but one performed with methodical intent, all while her conscious mind slept." This pattern of reenactment continued through January 1848. Dr. Ferris noted that the sequence always began the same way, with Eveline rising from her bed, moving to what would have been the kitchen location at 3 Oaks, then proceeding through a series of movements that corresponded to the layout of the former plantation. The consistency of these movements, performed in a space she had never seen while awake, suggested to him that these were not random behaviors, but a repeating memory. By early 1848, the case had drawn the attention of Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a physician known for his theories regarding diseases supposedly unique to Black Americans. Theories now recognized as pseudoscientific justifications for slavery. Cartwright had published a paper in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal in 1851 describing drapetomania, which he claimed was a mental illness that caused enslaved people to run away from their captors. Cartwright visited Vicksburg in February 1848 and requested to examine Eveline. His reputation precedes him, though I question whether his notoriety in medical circles is based on scientific merit or his convenient theories that so perfectly align with economic interests of the planter class. Cartwright's assessment, preserved in a letter to a colleague in New Orleans, dismissed the complexity of Eveline's condition. "The case presented to me in Vicksburg is merely an example of dysesthesia ethiopica, the Negro disease that renders them insensitive to punishment and prone to destroying property." Ferris, perhaps protective of his patient or his research, initially refused, but eventually relented under pressure. C. arrived this afternoon with an air of authority that bordered on pomposity, Dr. Ferris recorded. The supposed sleepwalking is nothing more than cunning deception, allowing the subject to commit acts of rebellion while maintaining a facade of innocence. Dr. Ferris's journal reveals his disgust with Cartwright's assessment. Siki spent less than an hour in observation, having already determined his conclusion before arriving. He observed none of the nocturnal episodes, demanded no demonstration, asked few questions. His so-called diagnosis is nothing but the same tired ideology dressed in medical language. The most significant breakthrough in understanding Eveline's condition came in March of 1848, nearly a year after the fire. Dr. Ferris had begun experimenting with a form of hypnosis then known as mesmerism, named after Franz Mesmer. Under this induced trance state, Eveline was able to access memories that seemed locked away during her waking hours. Mesmerism had gained popularity in Europe and parts of the northern United States, but was viewed with skepticism in the South, where its associations with spiritualism raised concerns about Orthodox Christian practice. Going to read. Ferris's journal indicates he learned the technique from a visiting physician from Boston and practiced it initially on willing subjects from his regular practice before attempting it with Eveline. During one such session, transcribed in detail in the journal, Eveline spoke of events the night of the fire that she claimed to have no memory of when awake. According to this account, she had indeed risen from her sleeping pallet shortly after midnight. She described feeling as if she were watching herself from above as she took an oil lamp from the kitchen, walked to the main house, and deliberately set fire to the curtains in the parlor. The hands that held the lamp were mine, but they moved without my permission, she reportedly said. I could see what was happening, but could not stop it. It was as if someone else had taken control, someone who had been waiting for the right moment. When asked who this someone else might be, her response was cryptic. The one who remembers what happened by the river, the one who carries the scars that don't show. This session was apparently witnessed by another physician, Dr. Thomas Baldwin, who added his own notation to Dr. Ferris's journal entry. I attest that the subject spoke the words recorded above while in a mesmeric trance induced by Dr. Ferris. She exhibited all signs of being in a genuine altered state, with fixed pupils and reduced respiration. Upon awakening, she displayed complete amnesia regarding both the trance state and the content of her statements. Dr. Ferris speculated in his notes that Eveline might be suffering from what we would now recognize as dissociative identity disorder, a fractured sense of self resulting from severe trauma. The someone else she referred to could have been an alternate personality, one that remembered and sought retribution for abuses that her primary consciousness had suppressed. The reference to what happened by the river remained unexplained until April 1848, when Martha, the house servant who had previously testified about Eveline's sleepwalking, came to visit her at Dr. Ferris's residence. Their conversation, observed but not interrupted by the doctor, revealed a history unknown even to Eveline herself. According to Martha, whose account Dr. Ferris recorded secondhand several years earlier, Eveline had witnessed something deeply traumatic by the Big Black River involving the overseer Harlan Price. Martha was reluctant to provide specific details, saying only that some things shouldn't be spoken of, but they leave marks all the same. Whatever had occurred was apparently so distressing that Eveline had suppressed the memory entirely, though Martha believed this buried trauma resurfaced after the severe beating she received from Price 2 years before the fire. Martha's visit had not been approved by the Morgan family. She had used the pretext of delivering items to a household in Vicksburg to make the side journey to Dr. Ferris's property. Her risk in doing so underscores the bonds that existed within enslaved communities, persisting despite the deliberate efforts of owners to sever such connections. This revelation suggested a possible trigger for Eveline's condition. The severe beating she received from Price 2 years before the fire may have activated trauma associated with the earlier incident at the river, creating a subconscious connection between the overseer and past suffering. The sleepwalking episodes, beginning shortly after the beating, could have been manifestations of this resurfacing trauma. During subsequent mesmeric sessions, Dr. Ferris attempted to explore this connection further. His journal entries from late April 1848 describe Eveline's increasingly detailed recollections of the riverbank incident, though always from the perspective of an observer rather than participant. In one session, she described hiding behind a cypress knee at the water's edge, watching as a woman and a man argued. The man's face remained unclear in her recollection, but his stance and voice matched Price's. She remembers the sound of splashing, Dr. Ferris wrote, then silence, then the man walking away alone. These memories appear to have been suppressed, perhaps as a protective mechanism against the horror of what was witnessed. By summer 1848, Eveline's case had caught the attention of a wider medical community, albeit discreetly. Dr. Ferris prepared a paper detailing his observations and theories, though he was careful to anonymize the case and omit any details that might identify her or connect the events to the Three Oaks fire. He presented this paper to a small gathering of physicians in New Orleans in July 1848. The reception was mixed. Some colleagues found the case compelling evidence of the complexity of the human mind, while others dismissed it as an elaborate deception, or worse, evidence of the unstable nature of slaves. The paper was never published in medical journals of the time, though a manuscript copy was preserved in Dr. Ferris's personal papers. One physician present at this gathering, Dr. Martin Harwood of Baltimore, wrote in his diary an assessment that was remarkably prescient. Dr. F's case study, while dismissed by many Southern colleagues, strikes me as evidence that the human mind, regardless of race, possesses depths and complexities we are only beginning to fathom. The protective mechanisms described, whereby traumatic memories are sequestered from conscious awareness, align with observations I have made among soldiers who survived the Mexican War. The mind shields itself from what it cannot bear to contemplate. In August 1848, something unexpected happened. Eveline's sleepwalking episode stopped completely. For weeks, then months, she slept normally, showing no signs of the nocturnal activity that had defined her case. Dr. Ferris monitored her closely, noting that she seemed more at peace, though she still claimed to have no memory of setting the fire or of their sessions under hypnosis. This improvement coincided with news that reached Vicksburg in late July. Arlen Price, the overseer from Three Oaks, had been killed in a bar fight in Natchez. The details were sordid and unremarkable. A dispute over a card game, a knife drawn too quickly, a life ended in a pool of blood on a tavern floor. But the timing raised questions that Dr. Ferris noted in his journal. Curious that E.'s condition should resolve itself so completely following the death of P. A coincidence, perhaps, but one that suggests a connection between her affliction and the man who caused her suffering. The Natchez Free Trader newspaper of July 28, 1848, contained a brief mention of the incident. Local man H. Price, formerly employed as overseer at a Warren County plantation, died following an altercation at the Riverfront Tavern. No charges have been filed against J. Wilson, the other participant, as witnesses uniformly described the deceased as the aggressor. Wilson, a steamboat pilot, departed upriver the following morning. As 1848 gave way to 1849, Eveline's status began to change. Dr. Ferris, whose interest in her case had evolved into a broader concern for her welfare, took an unusual step. He began teaching her to read and write, activities that were illegal to share with slaves in Mississippi at that time. His journal justifies this decision as necessary for her treatment. To understand the mind, one must give it language. He shows remarkable aptitude for letters, absorbing in weeks what some struggle with for years. The penalties for teaching enslaved people to read were severe in antebellum Mississippi. An 1842 law prescribed fines of up to $500, equivalent to over $16,000 today, and potential imprisonment. Dr. Ferris's willingness to take this risk suggests his views on slavery may have been evolving, though he was careful never to express such sentiments explicitly in his journal. This education opened new avenues for understanding Eveline's experience. She began keeping her own journal, portions of which Dr. Ferris transcribed into his records. These writings reveal a woman of intelligence and perception, struggling to reconcile the person she knew herself to be with the actions attributed to her sleeping self. In one entry from February 1849, she wrote, "Dr. F. says I walked in my sleep and set the fire that burned 3 oaks. I have no memory of this, but I do not doubt him, as he has shown himself to be honest in all dealings. What troubles me is not the act itself. I cannot mourn the destruction of that place, but that some part of me could act with such purpose while another part remained ignorant. Am I 2 people occupying one body, and if so, which is the true Eveline?" Her writings also reflected on the nature of freedom and captivity. "A bird born in a cage may never have known the sky," she wrote in March 1849, "but something in its blood remembers flight. I dream often of places I have never seen, of walking on land where no one owns another." The political climate in Mississippi was growing increasingly tense during this period. The debate over slavery's expansion into new territories acquired after the Mexican-American War had intensified sectional conflicts. Even private expression of abolitionist sympathies could lead to social ostracism or worse. Dr. Ferris's actions in educating Eveline and his apparent plans for her future would have been seen as deeply subversive. By the spring of 1849, Dr. Ferris had begun making arrangements to send Eveline north. His journal entries become more guarded during this period, with coded references to arrangements and contacts that suggest involvement with abolitionists. The Underground Railroad was active in this period, helping slaves escape to free states and Canada. Among Dr. Ferris's papers, filed separately from the journal and discovered only during a comprehensive archival review in 1974, was a letter from a J.B. Sanderson of Cincinnati. Though worded carefully to avoid explicit statements, the letter clearly outlines a route and timeline for moving medical supplies north along the Ohio River, with references to safe warehouses in various locations. The last detailed entry regarding Eveline appears in Dr. Ferris's journal on May 17, 1849. "E. departs tomorrow. Papers have been arranged identifying her as my freed domestic, traveling to Philadelphia to care for my ailing sister. Contacts will meet her in Cincinnati. She carries with her a small journal containing her thoughts and a letter of introduction to Dr. H., who has expressed interest in continuing observations of her condition, though I suspect it will not recur. Some wounds, once acknowledged, begin to heal." The risk Dr. Ferris took in facilitating Eveline's escape cannot be overstated. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was only a year away, and even under existing laws, those who assisted escaping slaves faced severe legal penalties. Beyond the legal consequences, discovery would have meant professional ruin and social exile. The fate of Eveline after leaving Vicksburg remains largely unknown. Dr. Ferris's journal contains only one subsequent mention, dated November 1849. "Letter received from H. E. has reached Canada safely. She has taken a new name and finds employment as a seamstress. No episodes reported." Canadian census records from 1851 include several entries for women of appropriate age and described racial background who listed their occupation as seamstress, but none can be definitively identified as Eveline. If she did indeed remain in Canada, she likely joined one of the communities of formerly enslaved people that had formed in cities like Toronto, Hamilton, or St. Catharines. The Three Oaks Plantation was never rebuilt. The land was sold in parcels in 1850, mostly to smaller farmers unable to afford the large enslaved workforce that had made the original operation profitable. The Morgan family relocated to New Orleans, where they maintained a diminished but respectable position in society. No member of the family ever publicly spoke about the fire or Eveline. Property records from Warren County show that the parcels of the former Three Oaks plantation changed hands multiple times in the decades following the fire. Local farmers reported difficulties with crops planted on the site, particularly in the area where the main house had stood. Several noted that cotton refused to grow in a perfect rectangle corresponding to the former foundation, though other crops would flourish there. Dr. William Ferris continued his medical practice in Vicksburg until his death in 1869. His work with Eveline seems to have influenced his views on slavery. Records show he became quietly supportive of emancipation in the years leading up to the Civil War, though he never took a public stance that might have compromised his position in Southern society. During the Civil War, Dr. Ferris served as a surgeon for Confederate forces, as did most Southern physicians. However, his journal entries from this period express increasing disillusionment with the Confederate cause. By 1865, he was providing medical care to freedmen in Vicksburg, one of the few white doctors willing to do so. The journal that preserved this remarkable case remained hidden among his effects until 1965, when it was discovered during renovations to the building that had once housed his office. The finder, a contractor named Joseph Davis, recognized the potential historical significance and donated it to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where it remained largely overlooked until a graduate student researching sleep disorders came across it in 1968. This student, Margaret Wheeler, included a chapter on Eveline's case in her dissertation on the history of sleep medicine in America. Her work prompted renewed interest in Dr. Ferris's journal among medical historians, though the broader historical implications of the case, particularly regarding resistance to slavery, received less attention. Modern analysis of Eveline's case suggests she may have suffered from a combination of post-traumatic stress disorder and a severe form of parasomnia, possibly triggered by the psychological impact of the beating she received and its connection to earlier trauma. The precise control exhibited during her sleepwalking episodes, while unusual, is not without precedent in modern medical literature. Cases of sleep arson, fire setting during sleepwalking episodes, are rare but documented in contemporary forensic psychiatry. A 2002 case in Britain resulted in acquittal when experts testified that the defendant had been sleepwalking during the act. Eveline's case, if it occurred as described in Dr. Ferris's journal, would represent one of the earliest documented instances of this phenomenon. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Eveline's story is how effectively it was erased from official record. Had Dr. Ferris not maintained his detailed journal, or had it been destroyed rather than preserved, this case would exist only as a brief mention in property records, a plantation fire, cause listed as accidental. This pattern of erasure is common in the history of resistance to slavery. Acts of rebellion that could not be contained were often minimized, reframed, or simply struck from the record. Eveline's case is unusual not in that it happened, but that evidence of it survived at all. In 2012, a historical marker was proposed for the former site of Three Oaks Plantation, mentioning Eveline and the unusual circumstances of the fire. The proposal was rejected by the local historical society, citing insufficient documentation and concerns about promoting narratives that might encourage property destruction. The site remains unmarked today, indistinguishable from the surrounding farmland. The land where Three Oaks once stood has been used primarily for agriculture since the fire, though portions were temporarily abandoned during the Civil War when Vicksburg became a battleground. Current aerial photographs show no trace of the plantation's layout, though ground-penetrating radar studies conducted in 2015 by archaeologists from the University of Mississippi revealed the footprint of the main house and several outbuildings. Visitors to the area report nothing unusual about the location where Three Oaks once stood. The Big Black River continues its slow journey to join the Mississippi, carrying with it the sediment of centuries. But locals still speak in hushed tones about fires that sometimes appear and disappear along the riverbank on still April nights, lights that move with purpose as if carried by invisible hands. Such folklore is common throughout the South, where traumatic histories often find expression in ghost stories and local legends. Whether these particular tales have any connection to Eveline and the events of 1847 is impossible to determine, but they serve as a kind of cultural memory in a place where official history has been selective in what it preserves. Dr. Ferris's final journal entry regarding the case, dated 1868 during Reconstruction, offers a fitting epitaph. Looking back on Aya's case after nearly 20 years, I am struck not by the scientific curiosity it represented, but by the humanity it revealed. A mind fractured by circumstances beyond its control found a way to seek justice while protecting itself from the knowledge of its own actions. If her sleeping self did indeed set that fire, can we truly call it wrong? Some might say that Three Oaks burned by accident, others by deliberate action. I have come to believe it was something else entirely. It was consumed by memory, a reckoning long deferred but inevitable as the coming of dawn. The journals of Dr. William Ferris were removed from public access in 1969 for preservation purposes. Requests to examine them are routinely denied. The official position of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History is that they contain medically sensitive information that cannot be released. Unofficial sources suggest the restriction has more to do with the detailed account of Eveline's escape north, information that would have implicated Dr. Ferris in illegal activity during his lifetime. Historical research conducted in the 1990s by Dr. James Livingston of Howard University attempted to trace Eveline's path after leaving Mississippi. His work, published in the Journal of African American History, identified several possible candidates in Canadian records who might have been Eveline under a new name, but no conclusive evidence was found. The very success of the Underground Railroad, Livingston wrote, depended on obscuring the identities and paths of those it helped to freedom. This necessary secrecy now presents an insurmountable challenge to historians seeking to reconstruct individual journeys, and so the story of Eveline of Vicksburg remains in shadows, like so many aspects of American history that challenge comfortable narratives. She was a woman whose sleeping mind may have accomplished what her waking one could not, a reckoning with those who had caused her suffering and ultimately a path to freedom. The fire that consumed Three Oaks Plantation left no physical casualties but burned away the foundations of lives built on the control of others. Sometimes, it seems, justice arrives on silent feet in the dead of night, when all eyes are closed but one pair that sees with terrible clarity. What became of Eveline after reaching Canada remains largely conjecture. If the brief mention in Dr. Ferris's journal is accurate, she created a new identity for herself, leaving behind both her enslaved status and her troubled sleep. We can hope that in freedom, whatever fractures existed in her mind began to heal. In 1853, a small notice appeared in the Toronto Christian Guardian, a Methodist publication that often featured news relevant to the community of formerly enslaved people who had found refuge in Canada. It mentioned the marriage of an E.F. to a carpenter named Samuel Winters. The notice described the bride as formerly of Mississippi. While there is no definitive evidence linking this to Eveline, the timing and circumstances align with what little we know of her later life. The significance of Eveline's case extends beyond its unusual medical aspects. It represents one of countless acts of resistance to the institution of slavery, resistance that often took forms more subtle than open rebellion. If Dr. Ferris's account is accurate, Eveline's sleeping self found a way to strike back at oppression when her conscious mind could not allow such thoughts. Some historians who have studied the journal argue that Dr. Ferris himself may have embellished or even fabricated aspects of the case. His increasingly abolitionist sympathies, evident in his later writings, might have colored his documentation. Others contend that the clinical precision of his notes, consistent with medical knowledge of the time, but including observations that would only be validated by sleep research a century later, argues for their authenticity. What remains undisputed is that the Three Oaks plantation did burn in April 1847, and that a woman named Eveline was implicated but never formally charged. Beyond these basic facts, the story exists in a liminal space between documented history and narrative reconstruction. During the Civil War, Vicksburg became a crucial strategic target, suffering through a devastating 47-day siege in 1863 that left the city and surrounding areas in ruins. Records from this period are incomplete, and many stories like Eveline's were lost in the broader upheaval of war. The Emancipation Proclamation, and later the 13th Amendment, would free those still enslaved, but freedom came too late for countless individuals whose lives and struggles went unrecorded. In 1964, nearly a century after Dr. Ferris's death, a descendant of the Morgan family was interviewed for a local historical society project. Thomas Morgan IV, great-grandson of the plantation owner, claimed that family oral history held that the fire had been an insurance scheme gone wrong, that his ancestor had arranged the destruction of Three Oaks to address financial difficulties. This account contradicts both the official record and Dr. Ferris's journal, adding yet another layer to an already complex narrative. Archaeological work conducted at the site in the early 2000s recovered fragments of everyday life, broken pottery, buttons, tools, and personal items that offer glimpses into the material conditions of those who lived and worked there. Among these artifacts was a small carved wooden figure discovered near what would have been the slave quarters, a female form with arms raised, similar to traditional West African religious items. Carbon dating placed its creation to approximately 1845-1850. For modern sleep researchers, Eveline's case represents a tantalizing historical example of complex behaviors during parasomnia states. Dr. Carlos Martinez, writing in the Journal of Sleep Medicine in 2008, noted, "If accurately reported, this case predates formal medical recognition of complex sleep behaviors by decades and suggests that sleepwalkers are capable of far more sophisticated actions than previously believed. The psychological aspects, specifically the performance of acts aligned with suppressed emotional states, align with current understanding of the relationship between trauma and parasomnia. Psychological analysis of the case suggests that Eveline's sleepwalking may have represented a form of dissociative state triggered by trauma, both the past trauma at the river and the more recent trauma of the beating she received. In such states, individuals can perform complex actions without conscious awareness or subsequent memory, often expressing emotional content that the waking mind suppresses. The cultural context of Eveline's experience cannot be separated from the broader history of American slavery. The institution created conditions of extreme psychological stress, with few or no legitimate outlets for expressing the natural human reactions to oppression: anger, grief, resistance. Under such circumstances, the mind sometimes finds alternative channels for these emotions. Folklorist Dr. Vanessa Williams has documented similar stories across the South, tales of enslaved people who performed extraordinary feats or acts of resistance while in altered states of consciousness. These narratives, she writes, represent a cultural memory of resistance that could not safely be expressed in more direct forms. Whether historically accurate in every detail or not, they preserve an emotional truth about the experience of slavery and the human spirit's refusal to be fully subjugated. In Vicksburg today, a small museum dedicated to local history includes a brief mention of the Three Oaks fire in its Civil War-era exhibit. The single paragraph notes only that the plantation was destroyed by fire in 1847, reportedly due to an accident involving a household servant. Eveline's name does not appear, nor does any reference to the unusual circumstances documented by Dr. Ferris. This pattern of minimal acknowledgement extends to academic treatment of the case. Even in specialized works on slave resistance or medical history, Eveline's story typically receives at most a passing mention. The incomplete nature of the evidence, combined perhaps with discomfort about the implications, has relegated her to a historical footnote. Yet for those who have studied Dr. Ferris's journal in detail, Eveline emerges as a figure of remarkable complexity, a woman whose mind found a way to survive and ultimately escape circumstances designed to crush the human spirit. Her story, fragmentary as it is, offers a window into both the brutality of slavery and the resilience of those subjected to it. The fire that destroyed Three Oaks can be viewed through multiple lenses, as an act of resistance, as the manifestation of psychological trauma, as divine retribution, or simply as an accident. Perhaps it was all of these at once. What seems clear is that it marked a turning point not only in Eveline's life, but in the lives of all connected to the plantation. For the Morgan family, the fire represented a financial setback and a social embarrassment. For the enslaved community, it may have been perceived as justice, though the records are silent on their reactions. For Dr. Ferris, it initiated a journey that would gradually transform his views on the society in which he lived. And for Eveline herself, if we accept the narrative presented in the journal, the fire was an action taken by a part of herself that her waking mind could not acknowledge. Whether this represented psychological fracture or something approaching poetic justice is a question that resonates beyond this single case. In 2018, during renovations to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History building, a small notebook was discovered sealed within a wall cavity. Initial examination suggests it may be the personal journal Eveline kept during her time with Dr. Ferris, thought to have been lost when she traveled north. Preservation work is ongoing, and scholars hope this document might finally provide insight from Eveline's own perspective. Until this work is complete, we are left with fragments and echoes, a medical journal, scattered records, local legends, and the persistent questions about what really happened on that April night in 1847 when Three Oaks burned. For those who doubt this account, consider that history is always written by those who control the pen. How many Evelines might have existed, their stories extinguished like candle flames before they could catch and spread. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Sometimes it is merely proof of how thoroughly the powerful can erase what threatens their narrative. Some questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Did Eveline consciously plan the fire, using her known sleepwalking as a cover? Or did her unconscious mind truly act without her waking knowledge? Was Dr. Ferris a genuinely objective observer, or did he shape the narrative to align with his evolving views? And what of the stable boy who first implicated her? Was his testimony reliable, coerced, or fabricated? These uncertainties are typical of historical events involving marginalized individuals. The official record preserves certain voices while silencing others, creating gaps that subsequent generations must navigate with care, acknowledging both what we know and what we cannot know. What seems beyond dispute is that a woman named Eveline lived, suffered, and ultimately found her way to freedom against extraordinary odds. Her journey from enslaved sleepwalker to free woman represents one unique thread in the complex tapestry of American history, a history that continues to be re-examined and reinterpreted as new voices and perspectives emerge. The story of Eveline challenges us to consider not just the documented facts of history, but its silences, its erasures, and the lives that existed in the margins of the official record. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that the human spirit finds ways to survive even the most dehumanizing conditions, and that sometimes truth emerges most clearly in the spaces between established facts. The next time you find yourself awake in the dark hours listening to the sounds of your home settling around you, remember Eveline. Remember that the boundary between sleeping and waking, between action and intention, between memory and forgetting, is thinner than we like to believe. And sometimes, in the space between heartbeats, the mind remembers what it was never allowed to forget.